Reed, remember you're on slide duty. Okay, welcome everyone to chapter 5. Crazy story. We've developed all units completely except the entirety of chapter 5. So you guys are the first to actually be presented chapter 5 content, which is great. So yeah, dibs. Okay, so chapter 5 is all about leverage buyouts and private equity and how investment banks get their business from the two. So can anyone, we're going to go in order. Can anyone tell me what an LBO is? What does it stand for? Do you at least know what the acronym stands for? What's up, Jason? Leverage buyout. Perfect. What is a leverage buyout? What is leverage? Perfect. That's crazy. You've been doing your studying. What's private equity?
Private equity like that, Blackstone, like completely owned by.
Kind of, yeah. Blackstone is one of the companies that we're going to cover. And so private, amazing. Good job. See, you belong here, I promise. So private equity firms are buy-side finance institutions. What they do is they use leverage buyouts to invest in companies, and then they'll flip them for a profit. It's like car flipping, but kind of like on crack, right? So can anyone tell me what the difference is between the buy and the sell side? We covered this way back, chapter 2, but it's important, and I'll mention it occasionally. What's up?
Buy side is like what they buy.
That's actually kind of right. I mean, buy-side institutions are like mutual funds, hedge funds, private equity firms. The thing in common that you'll note with all of them is that they're usually buying some kind of security. What does the word security mean?
Stocks.
Investments. There we go. Yeah, some kind of investment. There we go. Okay. And sell-side institutions are going to be selling you something. Stockbrokers sell you things. Investment bankers sell you things. Their advice, they're going to sell you shares within an initial public offering. We covered the underwriting process in, chapter 3 and the latter half of chapter 2. So if you're confused about that, make sure to take a look at it. But let's just get straight into leverage buyouts and private equity. Oh, we already scanned that. Okay. So what exactly is a leverage buyout? Well, we kind of talked about it, right? But let's dive deeper into it. So it's when an undervalued company or division of one is purchased by some kind of sponsor firm, typically a private equity firm. So what does this word sponsor firm mean in this context? It's simply the firm that gets the money, assembles the money in order to enact some kind of LBO. So I'm not always going to use private equity firms. Private equity firms are the most common type of firm that will be using LBOs. There are general sponsor firms that may do it as well, like regular banks that have partnerships with private equity firms and so on. So whenever I say sponsor firm, just think of it as some kind of institution that gathers money to, enact an LBO, a leverage buyout on some kind of company. So what happens when you enact an LBO? Well, the purchase company goes from publicly traded to private. Can anyone tell me the difference between the two? What's the difference between, or at least what is a publicly traded company? What's notable about it? What's up, Chima? Exactly. Stocks of it are listed on public stock exchanges. The general public, me, you, Shane, and David, technically we need to be 18, but whatever, can buy those shares of stock, right? Now, what's a private company? What distinguishes a private company from a public company?
One's on the stock market.
Exactly. So that's public. And private, it's a bit difficult to gain access to that stock, right? You usually need to know an insider. Maybe you need to be one of the founders of the company, so on. There are ways you can buy private stock, but again, we kind of covered that you need to be an accredited investor, aka an investor that's verified by the Securities and Exchange Commission to invest in riskier things. But again, we talked about that in chapter 2. If you're confused, make sure to look at the Google Classroom. I can direct you after class. What's up? Exactly. You need to have more money, right? So leverage is equal to debt, like Jason already mentioned in the back. And debt is a major funding source for our leverage buyouts. And how exactly, so how does a loan work, guys? Let's say I wanted to take out a loan for a house. I wanted a mortgage. What do I need to put down in order to, secure that loan, to make sure that I don't default on that loan? Collateral. There we go. Collateral. Exactly. So you need to put something down so that the bank can verify that this guy, in the case that he defaults from the loan, will have one very valuable asset lost. And, a really good example of collateral, we're going to get to some analogies in a second, but if you go to the library during lunch, after school, whenever, you can actually play Switch on their TV in the back. I've started playing Switch. It's really fun. It's cool. I have senioritis, so I have nothing better to do, but it's okay, right? So what they'll usually make you do is turn in your phone. They'll give you some switch remotes, and what's your phone doing? It's acting as collateral in the case you, break a remote, or you decide to put one in your pocket and take it home. Well, they have your phone, so, is that really a decision you want to make? But again, that's what collateral is. And the assets of the company that's undergoing an LBO will typically act as collateral. So the company that's being bought, essentially. Occasionally, there will be occasional times in which the company that is actually enacting the LBO on the company to be purchased on the target company will pledge some assets as collateral as well. I'd assume that's going to happen when you're not doing too big of an LBO, but I'm not entirely sure on that. We can definitely ask our speaker when he does come. I mean, we always have speakers during socials.
Okay, so these are the collateral analogies that Ayan was talking about. So just to retell you guys, so the collateral is the property that someone who borrows an asset pledges to the lender in order to secure their loan payment. So for example, in a mortgage, your house serves as the collateral. If you stop paying your loan, they can just take the house back. So this in investment banking terms, if a sponsor firm borrows money to fund an LBO, certain assets of the company undergoing the LBO will be pledged as a collateral for the specific loan. So if you are unable to pay your loan, they can just take certain assets from that company instead of you actually paying your loan.
Excellent. Great job, Reed.
Oh yeah, and by the way, speaking of speakers, remember every single IBC social, we make one of these papers that assembles a ton of questions. The curriculum questions are always derived from whatever we learned that chapter. So chapter 4, all about M&A. We got a bunch of mergers and acquisitions questions, put it on here, and then we talked with Mr. Rana, if you guys remember.
Thank you.
So as An talked about, a private equity firm is usually the thing that facilitates an LBO. But what do private equity firms do? Private equity firms are financial sponsors that purchase an underappreciated company by an LBO and then flip it and sell for a profit. The main controversy, though, is that LBO sponsors are usually focused on making meaningful changes in the way that operates while also cutting costs. And these meaningful changes is what we're going to focus on. So by meaningful changes, they mean changing the location where it's manufactured. So instead of making them in America, they can make them in Mexico or China, domestic to overseas. Changing the marketing or distribution, so just the way they transport and distribute their product, and then removing certain divisions of a company. And this could mean loss of jobs for many people and uses of inhumane labor like child labor in different countries.
Exactly, and that's where the controversy comes into play, right? Because these firms, these sponsor firms that are usually enacting the LBO, let's say they're private equity, what do they want to do with this company? They want to sell it for a profit. AKA, they want to make as much money as possible. One really effective way to do that, unfortunately, is by laying off workers that really aren't being too productive. So, yeah.
Okay, so we just talked about private equity and the other parts of a leveraged buyout. So now we'll talk about where investment banking comes in. So the people / companies usually involved in an LBO are the sponsor firm. Like you can just read all of that, but the main important part that we're going to focus on this slide are investment banks. So two things. First is LBO candidacy, which is leveraged buyout candidacy. So first, they will obtain advice from investment banks on whether they are or aren't a target for LBO. So for example, if you aren't a target, investment banks will help position them to be a more attractive candidate because some firms want to get bought out, which an investment bank can help with through their network. So you can have investment banks reach out to their network to find potential purchasers for their target LBO firm. Second is post-LBO exits. When an LBO is successful, so if the leveraged buyout is successfully the transaction goes through, private equity sponsors will want to reap their profits and will ask investment banks to help them with valuation, strategic buyers, and secondary leverage buyouts. So as we just talked about, private equity firms are the ones doing the thing, and the investment banks are the ones facilitating the trade. So the way that investment banks make their profit is through like different transaction fees.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And I just wanted to mention a few things, although David did it really wonderfully. Right. the entire point of this chapter is to not just isolate our learning to leverage buyouts and private equity. What we really care about and give a crap about is, well, how investment banking comes into all of this, right? Because that is at least, well, the stage that we're going through right now. We're talking about investment banks, entrance into investment banking. And then later on, because investment banking itself is such a great pillar, such a great pedestal, you can easily transfer over to other buy-side roles like we talked about, private equity, venture capital, that are notoriously a bit more profitable. But the key thing here is, what are investment banks doing with these companies that want to get LBO'd? Well, they're advising them, and they're helping them, in the case that they aren't already a target for an LBO, develop certain things for that company to make them more attractive. What does this sound similar to? We covered it last unit. It's blank profile. Acquisition profile, right? So whenever a strategic buyer wants to buy a company of some sort, sometimes they're going to go to an investment bank and they're going to say, hey, look, I have XYZ. I want a company that has a lot of unused tax credits, a company that has a lot of debt capacity, and so on. And they're going to say, okay, can you identify me some companies and maybe isolate it to this industry and so on. Sometimes it'll be reversed. Sometimes a company that wants to be bought out by a strategic buyer will go to an investment bank and say, hey, how can I reallocate maybe my finances for this company to make myself appear more profitable, which is one really key thing of that acquisition profile. But we're moving away from M&A right now, from mergers and acquisitions, and we're going to leverage buyouts. Well, what exactly makes you a great firm for a leverage buyout? Well, we're going to learn about that later. So yeah, what's up? So for the actual buying portion of the LBO, they'll use cash, they'll use debt from limited partners, and I'll get to that in a second. But they use a wide variety of different funding sources. It's not just going to be straight cash. Sometimes it can be, but it'll usually be a combination of cash and debt, I believe. What's up? I mean, not exactly, because remember, we talked about how debt is a double-edged sword, right? If you can use debt so that you can actually gain more profit, pay off your debt, and have profit afterwards, then it's not a negative. No. So look, what we need to understand is something that we learned in, I believe, 2.1, right? What is leverage? Leverage is debt, right? And okay, let's put it in a real-world example. People think credit cards are terrible. When in reality, if you use a credit card right, it can be very beneficial to you. Why? It increases your credit score. What can you do with credit scores? You can buy things, right? Or at least you can be more qualified to invest in certain really big investments. And let's say that you have that financial mindset and you want to, invest in this big house, put it on rent, and so on. Yeah, at the end of the day, you're doing it with funds that you've borrowed, but because you've put yourself in such a good position, you're actually making money. You're paying back everything that you borrowed, and you're coming with a clean profit. So, one second, Shima. So when we're talking about leverage, we talked about how it's a double-edged sword. It can be dynamite if you don't know how to use it. If you just put a bunch of things on your credit card, right? If you just take out a bunch of money and you have no plan with it, but it can be very beneficial if you understand how it can make you profit, if you can pay all of that debt back really well. 1 second, Shima had a question first. What's up?
So since like firms, like private equity firms often have like an insane amount of money, but again, they do a lot of it with cash. But so when they do actually need to do that, like who's basically the bigger fish who has the more money?
Limited partners. We're going to get to that in a second. That's a good question.
So what's a smart way to use your credit card?
Well, I'm not a personal finance advisor, so I can't advise too much on that, but here's some tips I've heard. Never close a credit card because that can negatively affect your credit score. If you stop using a credit card, you can keep it on you and so on. And in fact, the more credit accounts you have, usually your credit score is a bit higher. But this is off topic, but it's definitely something you guys should look into. If you really want to set yourself up for success, certain credit card companies will have rewards programs that will allow you to travel across the world for free just because you use groceries or you pay for groceries with that credit card. And many times you're never going to have to pay interest on your credit card as long as you don't go over your balance or as long as that you don't take too much out and not pay back your principal at the end of the month and things like that. So, again, the entire point of that analogy was to show you that leverage, that debt, can be used very well. And in the case of private equity firms or LBO sponsor firms, whenever they take out a large amount of money, this is what they're doing to the company. They're putting the company on a hamster wheel. Essentially, the company is jogging as fast as it can to make enough profit each month to pay off the debt and to pay a profit to everyone that's invested within that LBO, the limited partners and the general partners. We're going to get to that in a second. But whenever a company undergoes an LBO, they're kind of on a hamster wheel because there is a lot of debt involved in this transaction. That's why it's called a leveraged buyout. And you, of course, need to pay that debt back and get a profit. And debt can be expensive. It can have interest and all those things like you were talking about, Reed. Does that hopefully clarify a few thoughts? Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much.
Of course, of course. Yeah, and so this is the important part. This is why I care about leverage buyouts and private equity, because investment banks get involved with them. After a private equity firm does its business, what do private equity firms do? They buy companies with an LBO, run them for a bit, usually up to 10 years, and then they sell them for a huge profit. Well, investment banks are going to help them with that latter part, exit the LBO, so that everyone can make money. And they do this via three ways, like David mentioned. The valuation, which connects to your initial public offering, in the case you have a bull market. I'll get into that in a second. Strategic buyers we all know is linked to M&A. So let's say you want to sell the company that, let's say the private equity firm wants to sell the company as a whole or get it acquired. Then they're going to identify a strategic buyer with their network. And then you have secondary leverage buyouts or recapitalizations. This will usually occur when these two options don't work. Essentially, it's just a way to prolong things. You kind of do another leveraged buyout on that same company. It's kind of complicated. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but you do another leveraged buyout on that company to stall things so that you can eventually sell it either via an IPO or get a strategic buyer to buy the firm. What's up?
So this is like slightly related. So when a private equity firm wants an investment bank like facilitate, the investment bank is responsible for valuing the company, correct?
That's in the case that the private equity firm wants to sell the company or make money off of it via an IPO.
So if the investment bank doesn't value the company like as much as the private equity firm thinks that it's worth, like the private equity firm ever just like jump from bank until they get the right price?
That's a great question. That I'm not entirely sure of, but keep note of that. We can ask that to our speaker. Who had this slide? Perfect. So I kind of already explained this, right? How exactly all of these function. But the key thing here is to note that this is where investment banking comes in. In that exit, when the private equity firm or the LBO sponsor firm wants to get out from that company and just make a profit off of it. So the first option is when there's a bull market. Can anyone tell me the difference between a bull and a bear market? Exactly, right? Because a bull goes up, a bull thrusts up, and a bear puts its claws downwards. Exactly, right? And remember, we talked all about animals in finance, with horses and donkeys combining together, making horse donkeys. We have shark repellent. We have lots of interesting representations of the financial world. Killer bees, there we go, killer bees. Pac-Man defense, yeah. But so essentially, we asked about killer bees. We never got to Pac-Man defense. We should have asked. He probably would have been clueless. I don't think most people know about the Pac-Man defense. What's up? Yeah, he didn't, because these are kind of selective jargon. Like, he didn't work in investment banking. He worked as an attorney, so he might not hear those terms a lot. But so essentially, with the valuation, investment banks will come in and say, hey, you want to sell this company via an IPO? Fine. How exactly is a company most commonly valued? Via its market capitalization. How do you calculate market capitalization? Multiply shares outstanding times the price per share. That gives you a general valuation of a company. And investment banks will kind of help that end process valuation when you do an IPO. They're also probably going to do some discounted cash flow analyses and use a lot of their valuation tools to determine, hey, what is this company worth? How much can we sell this stock for? And is it a bull market? Can we sell it for as much as we can without the stock breaking? Because we don't want, exactly. We got to emphasize it. We got to emphasize it. The last thing we want is both ends of the underwriting process, those institutional investors, and the company that we've bought shares from. The absolute last thing we want is for one of those ends to get feel cheated on. And we talked about that, I believe, in 2.2. Maybe it was 2.2. It was probably 2.2. So if you don't remember how the breakage of a stock works, go back to 2.2 on the Google Classroom. Strategic buyer. Finance is all about networking. Investment banks have vast networks. That's how they get a lot of business done, right? I can only get a lot of these speakers here because I have a vast network, because I've bolstered this, and people are like, hey, I want to speak with your students. It's the same thing in finance. The better the bank, the more business, the more clientele they may have, the more of a network they can outreach to, and the more of a chance that someone will respond to yes when they say, hey, do you think you want to buy this company? Could you be a strategic buyer for this company? Mergers and acquisitions, right there in a nutshell, right? And then you have those recapitalizations. In the case you can't find a strategic buyer, in the case that the markets are depressed right now, it's not a bull market, you might just try and prolong the LBO via secondary leverage buyout until one of these conditions can be met and you can make a tidy profit. This me? Shannon? Okay, no worries. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, let's talk about some big private equity firms. Can anyone name me some big investment banking firms? When I'm talking about big investment banking firms, hold up. I'm talking about bulge brackets. Can someone name me some bulge brackets? Remember, we have bulge brackets, middle market, although I don't really talk about middle market, so it's okay if you don't know any. Boutique, and then regional banks. So remember, bulge brackets are the biggest. Can anyone name me some of the biggest ones? Carlyle Group is a private equity firm that's attached to the Goldman Sachs. What's up? Citigroup. Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty sure that's right. Credit Suisse. There we go. Unfortunately, some things happened with Credit Suisse, though. They might have gotten acquired. What's up? I mean, all hell must break loose, I guess. With SVB, a lot of hell broke loose.
How long do you think it took to like reach a deal on that? Like how long
I
do
don't-
you think investment bank? Do you think it's like there's some investment bankers that wait on that for like $2.50?
I'm sure. I mean, when you come to the law side, at least, like with the attorney, what did he say? Things could take from 4 months to 2 years. So I'd assume things like horizontally translate over to finance. Okay, so you guys named Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, etc. Right? So some big PE firms, Carlyle Group, which is a part of Goldman Sachs. So remember, I talked about this a while back. I talked about how sometimes big banks have investment banks within them, and sometimes those big banks also have private equity firms within them. So on, Goldman Sachs is one of those. You also have Apollo Global Management. Apparently, everyone at Apollo are massive PP heads. They're not nice. That's what I've heard from like every single person that works in finance. What they'll usually do is they'll try and like extort you. Oh, when it comes to the leverage bout or something, I read some article. It was some pretty crazy stuff. I'll send it to you guys. And then you have Blackstone Group. Blackstone, of course, evil wizards own everything, right? But I mean, that's why they make a lot of money, right? And then KKR and Company. JP Morgan, that is a great investment bank. So private equity firms, alongside general leverage buyout firms, so essentially any sponsor for a leverage buyout, will gather the assets of investors, cash for the most part, and will invest it in a variety of companies using an LBO fund. What's up? Wells Fargo. They might be. I'm not entirely sure. You might be right. I'm sure they have an investment banking division. Yeah, I mean, all banks really have a ton of... Remember, we went to... If you go to 1.1, you're good, 1.1, our first presentation, you're going to see how banks are profit-making behemoths. They have a very large menu of services. Some investment banks, not regular banks that have investment banking divisions. Some investment banks will have brokerage services, will have like asset management things. The Chinese wall is something that's instituted so that insider trading doesn't occur between divisions of an investment bank. I don't know where you were going to get there, but you know, I like that you remember that. Oh, okay, perfect. That's great. But okay. This is what PE firms do, and one thing I want you guys to note is that private equity firms, as ballsy as they sound, are some of the most risk-averse financial institutions. What they'll usually do with their leverage buyouts is they'll invest in like a ton of different companies, because a lot of companies have that chance of failing, right? They'll invest in a ton of companies, and then they'll get to their limited partners, aka the people that are giving these private equity firms, these sponsors, money, right? They'll go to their limited partners and say, hey, invest in my LBO fund. So not an individual LBO of a company, but a fund. Meaning that it's a ton of different companies that you're investing in the LBO of. And if one of them profits, then you'll probably make marginal returns. So LBO funds are LBO sponsors setting up specific funds that invest in the bank so that investors can invest in LBOs multiple as opposed to just one to mitigate risk. What does this sound similar to? Blank fund. Blank fund, not hedge fund, blank fund. Mutual fund, there we go. What are mutual funds? They're just securities that compile a bunch of stocks, and it's kind of similar to that, except there are a few exceptions. Mutual funds are very liquid, right? If you have a sizable share in an LBO fund, they're not as liquid. They don't trade day to day. Other things are LBOs usually last for a very long time. Like I did say, you have that deadline to like 10 years. Mutual funds pretty fast. Also, when we talk about LBOs and we talk about general and limited partners, usually the LBO sponsor, like the private equity firm, is investing their literal wealth within that company. So they want to make sure everything goes right for that company. If you invest in a mutual fund, the people that are investing in those baskets of stock don't own anything in that company, right? They don't work for that company, so they don't really have an incentive. They might not be a share. That might be like insider trading, actually. But they'll invest in that company for you, for the mutual fund, right? But they don't really have any incentive to make sure that company is as profitable as possible. They don't literally work there. It's kind of similar to like management of a company. Let's say, like I went to Deloitte for Accounting 1 on a field trip, right? And when I went to Deloitte, they said that as people increase up the corporate ladder, they usually get a larger equity within their company when it comes to stock, so that the actual decisions of these management, of these people, are in line with shareholders, because that's a key thing. What do we need to do? Increase shareholder value, right? And that's kind of how exactly. And that's how everything ties together. An LBO fund, very wide, invest in a lot of things. So most LBO sponsors set up their funds as limited partnerships. Investors will serve as limited partners and are entitled to cash flow from the investment. And the key thing of limited partnerships is that you're only legally liable for the debt of the actual investment that you put in, so not of the investment as a whole. And this is key, right? Does anyone remember when limited partnerships or LLPs kind of became a big thing in America? Literally, we learned it in A-Push, right? It was literally like in the founding of America. Yeah, whenever companies were getting charters in order to come to America, the only way they can really do it was by establishing limited partnerships, so that people could invest a small portion of money and only be responsible for that small portion of money, not all of the money that's been compiled in aggregate for that investment, for that venture. So that's a key thing to note. That's just an interesting little factoid. But the LBO sponsor himself, gets money from limited partners, but the LBO sponsor, like the private equity firm, will be considered the general partner. So essentially, they have domain over everything. They are managing everything, and they have ownership interests of that target firm. So what's the con of being this general partner? They're responsible for the debts of the partnership. They have a lot more liability. They have a lot more money in the game, right? A much bigger stake. The pro is due to ownership interests, right? Because they have such a large stake, unlike things like mutual funds, although to some extent, of course, they're going to want to increase profits as much as possible. Right here, your life is literally on the line, because you've invested such a large share of your money within that company. So you're going to make sure that everything is aligned with the actual increase of the value of the company, right? Not just for personal gain or anything like that. All right, so to surmise that, we're going to quickly go over a general overview of the differences between a limited partner and a general partner. So remember, general partner is the actual LBO sponsor, like a private equity firm. Limited partners, the people that give money to those LBO sponsors, to those private equity firms, to the general partners, in order to complete that investment.
So yeah, as I was talking about, we have the general and limited partners. They have some similarities, so they're both invested in the partnership, as you talked about. They both take profits and losses depending on how well it goes, and they also own a share of the partnership. But the main ways that they differ is the general partner, as you said, has greater liability because he has more control over the partnership, and they're also responsible for the daily operations and control the management. Whereas a limited partner only is responsible for their investment, and they don't participate in the operations or any of the structure of the partnership.
Investor, essentially, yes. Okay, perfect. Good job, guys. So that was your introduction. Right, later on we're going to learn, what makes an LBO, what makes a target firm an attractive LBO candidate, and so on. Kind of similar to M&A, we developed that acquisition profile and so on. And then we're just going to learn a ton more about private equity, leverage buyouts, and how investment banks do their thing, make their money with them. And guys, remember, I teach introductory investment banking factoids and so on, because investment banking is kind of that pillar to transition into a lot of these other various more lucrative areas of finance. Let's say you want to work in growth equity, venture capital, kind of like Shark Tank. Let's say you want to work in private equity. If you want to work at a hedge fund and manage people's money literally and use macro and microeconomic trends to determine whether or not some kind of stock or investment is going to appreciate, if that's your thing, right? Asset management, aka. Well, investment banking for most people is the start of that. If you go to a super target like Morton or Harvard, you might be able to get into private equity, hedge funds immediately. But for most people, that's not the case. So investment banking is usually a start for them, or in the case that they can't get into investment banking at all because it's almost equally as selective as these other things, well, they'll get an MBA, right? So this is a great way for you guys to start early. And remember, can't get into PE immediately, VC immediately. Investment banking is a great place to start, or you could just be in investment banking. I know, that's the thing, right? Who wants to be an MBA associate? Everyone knows that those guys are douchebags. And again, these are the credits. If you want to look a bit more into certain Investopedia things and so on. Yeah, see you guys.